In 1924, police entered the home of a quiet church organist and uncovered one of the most horrifying discoveries in European criminal history. Let us know which country or state you're listening from. We love to hear where our true crime community is watching from. The story of Karl Denke is one that lingers in the shadows of European criminal history. A tale not of a notorious outlaw or a flamboyant villain, but of a man who, for decades, blended seamlessly into the fabric of his small town. To understand how such a figure could exist undetected, we must begin at the very start, with the birth of a boy in the Silesian countryside in the waning years of the 19th century. Karl Denke was born on August 12, 1860, in the village of Oberkunzendorf, near Münsterberg, a region then part of the Kingdom of Prussia, now Ziebice, in modern-day Poland. The world he entered was one of rural tradition, marked by the rhythms of farming life and the close-knit bonds of small communities. The Denke family, like many in the area, were modest landowners. They were neither wealthy nor destitute, but they were respected, known for their hard work and their adherence to the customs of the time. From an early age, Karl was described as a quiet, somewhat withdrawn child. He was not given to the rough games of other boys, nor did he seek out the company of many friends. Instead, he preferred solitary walks in the woods, or long hours spent reading the Bible and local newspapers. His teachers noted his intelligence, but also his shyness, a boy who rarely spoke unless spoken to, and who seemed to carry a certain sadness in his eyes. As he grew into adolescence, Karl's reserved nature only deepened. His father, a stern and practical man, hoped his son would take over the family farm. But Karl struggled with the physical demands of rural labor, and after his father's death he sold his share of the land to his brother. This decision, though practical, set him apart from the rest of his family and marked the beginning of a life lived largely on the margins. By the late 1880s, Denke had moved to Münsterberg, a small but bustling town with a population of just over 7,000. Here, he purchased a modest house at 10 Stawowa Street, a two-story building with a small garden and a workshop at the back. It was a humble dwelling, but it offered Karl the privacy he seemed to crave. In Münsterberg, Denke quickly established a reputation as a reliable, if somewhat eccentric, member of the community. He attended church regularly, where he played the organ with quiet devotion. His music was said to be somber, yet moving, a reflection perhaps of the man himself. He was known to help out at church events, donating small sums to charity and assisting with repairs when needed. Neighbors described him as polite and soft-spoken. He rarely raised his voice, and he never seemed to lose his temper. Children in the neighborhood recalled that he would sometimes hand out sweets or offer a kind word to those in need. He was in many ways the embodiment of the small-town ideal, a man who kept to himself, but who could always be counted on in times of trouble. Yet, even in these early years, there were hints that all was not as it seemed. Denke was intensely private, rarely inviting anyone into his home. He was known to keep odd hours, often seen leaving his house late at night or returning in the early hours of the morning. Some neighbors whispered that he was simply a loner, a man who preferred his own company. Others speculated that he was still mourning the loss of his family, or that he suffered from some unnamed melancholy. Despite these rumors, Denke's reputation remained largely untarnished. He was, after all, a man of the church, a position that carried significant weight in a town like Münsterberg. The local pastor spoke highly of him, praising his dedication and his willingness to help those less fortunate. When the town faced hard times, Denke was often among the first to offer assistance, whether it was a loaf of bread for a hungry family or a few coins for a struggling neighbor. Over the years, Denke supplemented his modest income by taking on odd jobs. He worked as a laborer, a handyman, and occasionally as a peddler, selling homemade goods at the local market. He was known for his skill with tools, and his workshop was filled with carefully maintained equipment, saws, hammers, and knives, all arranged with meticulous precision. To the outside world, Karl Denke was a model citizen, hardworking, charitable, and deeply religious. He was the kind of man who could be trusted to watch over a neighbor's house or to lend a hand in times of need. His reclusive habits were seen as quirks, nothing more, the harmless eccentricities of a man who had suffered his share of life's hardships. But beneath this veneer of respectability, something far darker was taking shape. Denke's isolation, his obsession with order, and his reluctance to form close relationships were all signs that, in hindsight, pointed to a troubled mind. Yet, in the Münsterberg of the early 20th century, such traits were easily overlooked. The town was a place where everyone knew everyone else, or so they thought. As the years passed, Denke's presence became a fixture in the community. He was seen at every Sunday service, his hands moving deftly over the organ keys. He attended funerals and weddings, always dressed in the same somber black suit. He was, in many ways, invisible, a man who moved through life without drawing attention, who kept his secrets well hidden. It would take decades and a chance encounter on a cold December night for the truth about Karl Denke to finally come to light. Until then, he remained the quiet man of Münsterberg, a figure of trust and charity, whose true nature was known only to himself. In the next part, we'll explore how Denke's relationship with the community allowed him to move unnoticed, and how he began to lure those who would become his victims. Stay with us as we unravel the layers of deception that made Karl Denke one of history's most chilling hidden killers. In the years following his quiet arrival in Münsterberg, Karl Denke's reputation as a helpful if somewhat peculiar neighbor only grew. The town itself was a place where everyone's business was, in some way, everyone else's. Yet Denke managed to exist on the periphery. Always present, always polite, but never truly known. This delicate balance between visibility and invisibility would become the foundation of his double life. Denke's home at 10 Stawawa Street was a modest, two-story structure, set back from the road and partially obscured by a tangle of shrubs and fruit trees. The garden was well tended, and the windows were always clean. To passers-by, it was the home of a man who took pride in his surroundings, who valued order and routine. Few ever crossed the threshold, and those who did rarely ventured beyond the front room. Despite his reclusive habits, Denke was a familiar figure in the town's daily life. He could be seen at the market, haggling over the price of potatoes or selling homemade vinegar and jams. He was known to offer odd jobs to those in need, a day's work in his garden, or help with repairs in exchange for a meal or a few coins. For the town's poor and transient population, Denke's offers were a lifeline. It was this reputation for charity that allowed Denke to move unnoticed among the most vulnerable members of society. Münsterberg, like many towns in the region, was not immune to the hardships of the early 20th century. The years after World War I were marked by economic instability, inflation, and widespread poverty. Homelessness was common, and many people drifted from town to town in search of work or shelter. Denke's kindness seemed genuine. He would approach those huddled in doorways or lingering near the train station, offering them food, a place to rest, or the promise of work. He was never forceful, never threatening. Instead, he presented himself as a benefactor, a man who understood hardship and was willing to help those less fortunate. For many, Denke's home became a place of refuge. He would invite them in, offer a hot meal, and sometimes allow them to sleep in his spare room. Some stayed for only a night. Others returned again and again, grateful for his generosity. Few questioned his motives. In a world where kindness was rare, Denke's offers were accepted at face value. But behind this facade of charity, Denke was carefully selecting his victims. Police records and later investigations would reveal a chilling pattern. Most of those who disappeared were outsiders, drifters, beggars, or travelers with no family in the area. They were people who would not be missed, whose absence would go unremarked. Denke's method was as simple as it was effective. He preyed on those who had fallen through the cracks of society. The townspeople, for their part, saw only what Denke allowed them to see. He was the man who played the organ at church, who donated to the poor box, who never caused trouble. His odd hours and solitary habits were explained away as quirks. If anyone noticed that some of the men and women who visited his home never returned, they said nothing. In a town where survival was a daily struggle, the fate of a stranger was rarely a topic of conversation. Denke's ability to blend in was aided by his meticulous attention to detail. He kept careful records of his finances, paid his bills on time, and maintained cordial relations with local officials. He was never in debt, never involved in disputes. His workshop was a model of order, with every tool in its place and every surface scrubbed clean. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of respectability. Yet, there were moments when Denke's mask slipped. Some neighbors recalled seeing him carrying heavy sacks late at night, or hearing strange noises from his workshop. A few noticed the peculiar smell that sometimes drifted from his property, but these observations were quickly dismissed. After all, Denke was known for making his own sausages and preserves. The odors were simply part of his culinary experiments, or so people believed. The local police, too, saw no reason to suspect Denke. He had no criminal record, no history of violence or theft. When questioned about the occasional disappearance of a vagrant or traveler, he would shrug and suggest that they had moved on to another town. In an era before modern forensic science and centralized record-keeping, such explanations were rarely challenged. Denke's success as a predator lay in his understanding of human nature. He knew that people were more likely to trust someone who appeared harmless, who offered help without asking for anything in return. He cultivated an image of harmless eccentricity, using his age and gentle demeanor as a shield. In a community where everyone was struggling, Denke's small acts of kindness made him indispensable. But beneath this carefully constructed persona, Denke was driven by compulsions that even he may not have fully understood. Later, psychological analyses would suggest that he exhibited traits consistent with severe personality disorder, a lack of empathy, an ability to compartmentalize his actions, and a profound sense of isolation. Yet, at the time, such concepts were unknown. To his neighbors, Denke was simply a quiet man who kept to himself. As the years passed, the list of missing persons in Münsterberg grew. Most were never reported, their names lost to history. But for those who survived on the margins, Denke's home remained both a beacon of hope and, unknowingly, a place of unimaginable danger. It would take a single act of resistance, a victim who refused to become another statistic, to shatter the illusion that had protected Denke for so long. In the next part, we will recount the night when one man's desperate escape brought the police to Denke's door and set in motion an investigation that would shock the world. Stay with us as we continue to unravel the story of Karl Denke, the trusted neighbor whose kindness hid a secret darker than anyone could have imagined. December 21st, 1924 began like any other winter evening in Münsterberg. The streets were quiet, dusted with snow, and the townspeople hurried home to escape the chill. In the heart of the town, Karl Denke's house stood as it always had. Unremarkable, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight, no one could have guessed that inside, a desperate struggle was about to shatter decades of silence. The man who would bring Denke's secret life to light was Vincent Olivier, a young laborer who had fallen on hard times. Like so many before him, Olivier was drawn to Denke's home by the promise of food and shelter. He had met Denke earlier that day at the train station, where Denke offered him a meal and a place to stay for the night. Grateful and weary, Olivier accepted. The evening began innocuously enough. Denke served a simple supper: bread, sausage, and beer. He was, as always, polite and soft-spoken, asking Olivier about his travels and offering advice on where to find work. The conversation was unremarkable, the kind of small talk that fills the silence between strangers. But as the night wore on, something in Denke's demeanor changed. He grew quieter, his gaze more intense. According to Olivier's later statement to police, Denke invited him into the back room, ostensibly to show him a place to sleep. As Olivier stepped inside, Denke attacked him without warning, striking him on the head with a heavy object. Dazed but not unconscious, Olivier fought back, managing to fend off further blows. In the chaos, he stumbled toward the door, blood streaming from his scalp. Olivier's escape was nothing short of miraculous. He burst out of Denke's house and ran through the snow-covered streets, shouting for help. His cries quickly drew the attention of a nearby patrolman, who rushed to his aid. Olivier, disoriented and bleeding, pointed back toward Denke's house, gasping out a story of betrayal and violence. The patrolman, recognizing the gravity of the situation, summoned reinforcements. Within minutes, several officers arrived at 10 Stawowa Street. They found Denke calm and composed, his clothes stained with blood. When questioned, Denke claimed that Olivier had attacked him first, and that he had acted in self-defense. The officers, unconvinced, placed Denke under arrest and began a search of the premises. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The initial search of Denke's home revealed a scene of unsettling order. The front rooms were tidy, the furniture neatly arranged, and the floors swept clean. But as the officers moved deeper into the house, they began to notice oddities: a faint metallic smell in the air, stains on the floorboards, and a collection of tools that seemed out of place in a home workshop. In the back room where Olivier had been attacked, the officers found a blood-stained axe and a heavy wooden mallet. There were signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, broken glass, and splatters of blood on the walls. It was clear that a violent confrontation had taken place, but the true extent of Denke's activities was not yet apparent. The officers detained Denke and escorted him to the local jail, where he was placed under guard. Meanwhile, word of the incident spread quickly through Münsterberg. The townspeople, shocked by the news, gathered in small groups to discuss what had happened. Many refused to believe that Denke, the quiet organist, the charitable neighbor, could be capable of such violence. As the night wore on, the police continued their search. In the cellar, they discovered a locked door leading to a small, windowless room. Inside, they found a collection of barrels, jars, and sacks, each carefully labeled in Denke's meticulous handwriting. The contents of these containers would soon become the focus of a full-scale criminal investigation. By morning, the authorities realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than a simple assault. The evidence suggested a pattern of behavior that stretched back years, perhaps decades. The police chief, recognizing the potential scale of the case, contacted higher authorities in Breslau, now Wrocław, requesting assistance from experienced investigators. As news of Denke's arrest spread beyond Münsterberg, journalists and officials from across the region descended on the town. The local press, initially cautious, began to speculate about the nature of Denke's crimes. Rumors swirled. Some claimed he was a thief, others whispered of darker deeds. The truth, as the investigators would soon discover, was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. In the days that followed, the police conducted a thorough search of Denke's property. They cataloged every item, photographed every room, and interviewed neighbors, acquaintances, and anyone who had ever set foot in the house. The investigation was painstaking, hampered by the lack of modern forensic techniques but driven by a growing sense of urgency. Olivier, recovering from his injuries, provided a detailed account of his ordeal. He described Denke's sudden transformation from kindly host to violent attacker, and his own desperate fight for survival. His testimony, combined with the physical evidence, left little doubt that Denke had intended to kill him. The townspeople, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the emerging portrait of a predator. Some refused to believe the accusations, insisting that Denke must have been provoked. Others recalled odd incidents, strange smells, missing travelers, unexplained stains, but had never connected them to Denke. As the investigation deepened, the police began to uncover a pattern. Denke's victims were almost always outsiders, people with no ties to the community. He had chosen his targets carefully, ensuring that their disappearances would go unnoticed. The scale of his crimes was still unknown, but it was clear that Münsterberg had been harboring a killer in its midst. In the next part, we will follow the police as they begin to unravel the full extent of Denke's activities and make the first of many shocking discoveries inside his home. The story of Karl Denke was only just beginning to unfold, and the secrets hidden within his house would soon horrify all of Europe. The morning after Karl Denke's arrest, the town of Münsterberg awoke to a sense of unease that quickly spread through its narrow streets. The news that Denke, the quiet church organist and trusted neighbor, had been taken into custody for a violent attack was shocking enough. But as police began their methodical search of his home, it became clear that the truth was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The investigation was led by Chief Inspector Karl Denke, a seasoned officer from Breslau, who arrived with a small team of detectives. Their first task was to secure the property and begin a systematic search. The house at 10 Stawowa Street, so ordinary from the outside, soon revealed itself to be a labyrinth of secrets. The front rooms, as the initial patrol had noted, were meticulously clean and orderly. Denke's personal effects were few and modest: a Bible, a collection of hymnals, and a wardrobe of somber black suits. The kitchen was well stocked with jars of preserves and smoked meats hanging from the rafters. At first glance, it was the home of a man who valued thrift and self-sufficiency. But as the investigators moved deeper into the house, the atmosphere changed. In the back room where Vincent Olivier had been attacked, they found a disturbing array of tools: axes, saws, cleavers, and knives, all sharpened to a fine edge and arranged with almost obsessive care. The walls bore faint stains, and the floorboards showed signs of repeated scrubbing. It was clear that this room had seen violence before. The real shock came when the detectives descended into the cellar. The air was cold and damp, heavy with a metallic tang that set their nerves on edge. Here, in the dim light of their lanterns, they discovered a locked door. Forcing it open, they entered a small, windowless chamber that would soon become infamous throughout Europe. Inside, the police found dozens of large jars, each carefully labeled in Denke's neat handwriting. The labels bore names, dates, and cryptic notations. Some jars contained what appeared to be pickled meat, preserved in brine or vinegar. Others held fat, bones, and other remains. There were barrels filled with what looked like salted flesh, and sacks containing human hair and teeth. The detectives, trained to deal with theft and violence, were unprepared for the horror of what they had uncovered. They cataloged each item, photographing the scene and making detailed notes. The inventory grew longer with each passing hour: 16 large cooking pots, 4 barrels, 2 large wooden tubs, and dozens of smaller containers. In total, the police would recover over 30 kilograms of human remains, preserved and stored with chilling precision. In a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, they found a collection of personal effects: wallets, identity papers, pocket watches, and jewelry. Each item was tagged and stored, as if Denke had kept a record of his victims. The names on the documents were unfamiliar: transients, laborers, and travelers who had passed through Münsterberg and vanished without a trace. The police also discovered a detailed ledger written in Denke's careful script. The book listed dates, names, and amounts of money, payments received, debts owed, and what appeared to be a record of each victim. The entries were methodical, almost businesslike, and spanned more than a decade. It was clear that Denke had kept track of his crimes with the same diligence he applied to every other aspect of his life. As the investigation continued, the scale of Denke's activities became apparent. For years, he had lured vulnerable people into his home, offering them food, shelter, or work. Once inside, they had been murdered, their bodies dismembered and processed with the skill of a butcher. The remains were preserved, stored, and, as some would later suspect, possibly sold or consumed. The forensic techniques of the 1920s were limited, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jars and barrels contained unmistakable human remains, and the personal effects matched the descriptions of missing persons from across the region. The police estimated that Denke had killed at least 30 people, though the true number may never be known. The townspeople, when informed of the discoveries, were stunned into silence. Many refused to believe that Denke, the man who played the organ at their weddings and funerals, could be responsible for such atrocities. Others recalled odd incidents: the strange smells from his cellar, the heavy sacks he carried late at night, the travelers who had come to town and never left. In hindsight, the signs were there, but no one had connected them to Denke. The press descended on Münsterberg, eager for details. Reporters from Breslau, Berlin, and even as far as Vienna arrived to cover the unfolding story. The local authorities, overwhelmed by the attention, struggled to maintain order. Rumors spread quickly and the facts became distorted in the retelling. Some claimed that Denke had sold human meat at the market. Others whispered that he had supplied local restaurants. The truth, as always, was more complex and elusive. The police, for their part, focused on the evidence. They interviewed neighbors, market vendors, and anyone who had interacted with Denke. They traced the origins of the personal effects, attempting to identify the victims. The process was slow and painstaking, hampered by the lack of centralized records and the transient nature of many of Denke's targets. Throughout it all, Denke remained largely silent. In custody, he was calm and cooperative, answering questions with polite indifference. He offered no explanation for the contents of his cellar, nor did he express remorse. To the officers who guarded him, he seemed almost detached, as if the events unfolding around him were of no concern. The discovery of Denke's house of secrets sent shockwaves through Münsterberg and beyond. The town, once a place of quiet routine, was now the center of a criminal investigation that would make headlines across Europe. The people of Münsterberg struggled to come to terms with the reality that a killer had lived among them for years, hidden in plain sight. In the next part, we will examine the police investigation in greater detail. The painstaking work of cataloging evidence, the search for missing persons, and the growing realization that Denke's crimes were unlike anything the region had ever seen. The story of Karl Denke was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a case that would haunt the collective memory of a continent. The days following the discovery in Karl Denke's cellar were marked by a sense of disbelief and mounting horror. The police, now joined by forensic specialists from Breslau, faced the daunting task of piecing together the full extent of Denke's crimes. The house at 10 Stowoa Street was transformed into a crime scene, its every corner scrutinized for clues. Chief Inspector Karl Langer and his team began by cataloging the evidence. Each jar, barrel, and container was carefully opened, its contents examined and recorded. The process was slow and methodical, requiring both scientific rigor and emotional fortitude. The investigators worked in shifts, documenting every item and photographing the scene. The cellar, once a place of secrecy, was now laid bare under the harsh glare of lanterns and camera flashes. The ledger found among Denke's belongings became a key focus of the investigation. Written in his precise, almost obsessive handwriting, it contained a list of names, dates, and cryptic notes. Some entries included amounts of money, while others referenced items of clothing or personal effects. The police quickly realized that this was not a simple account book. It was a record of Denke's victims. Matching the names in the ledger to missing persons proved challenging. Many of Denke's victims were transients, laborers, beggars, and travelers who had no fixed address. The police sent descriptions of the recovered personal effects to towns and villages across Silesia, hoping to find relatives or acquaintances who could identify them. In some cases, families came forward, recognizing a watch, a ring, or a wallet as belonging to a loved one who had disappeared. The process was painstaking and often heartbreaking. For every victim identified, there were others whose fate remained unknown. The police estimated that Denke had killed at least 30 people, but the true number could be higher. Some entries in the ledger were so vague that they offered little hope of identification. The authorities were forced to confront the grim reality that many of Denke's victims would never be named. As the investigation continued, the police uncovered further evidence of Denke's meticulous planning. He had kept detailed records of his finances, noting every transaction and expense. He had also maintained a collection of tools, each carefully cleaned and stored after use. The level of organization was striking. Denke had operated with a degree of precision that suggested both intelligence and a profound lack of empathy. The forensic specialists examined the remains found in the cellar, attempting to determine the cause of death and the methods used to dispose of the bodies. The limitations of early 20th century science made this a difficult task, but the evidence was clear. Denke had dismembered his victims with skill, preserving parts of their bodies in jars and barrels. The investigators were left to speculate about his motives. Was it purely practical, or did it serve some deeper psychological need? The search for missing persons expanded beyond Münsterberg. Police in Breslau, Berlin, and other cities were alerted to the case, and descriptions of Denke's methods were circulated to law enforcement agencies across Germany. The hope was that similar cases might be linked, providing further insight into Denke's activities. In some instances, families who had given up hope of finding their loved ones now faced the devastating possibility that they had fallen victim to the butcher of Münsterberg. The psychological profile of Denke began to take shape. Experts consulted by the police described him as a classic example of a hidden killer, someone who could maintain a facade of normalcy while committing unspeakable acts in secret. His ability to compartmentalize his life, to separate his public persona from his private actions, was both remarkable and deeply disturbing. Neighbors and acquaintances were interviewed at length. Many struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the reality of his crimes. Some recalled odd incidents, a strange smell from the cellar, Denke's habit of carrying heavy sacks late at night, or his reluctance to allow visitors into certain parts of the house. Others insisted that Denke had always been kind and generous, a man who helped those in need. The contrast between Denke's public image and his private actions became a central theme of the investigation. The local press, initially cautious, now reported on the case with growing intensity. Headlines described Denke as a monster and a butcher, and rumors spread quickly through the town. Some claimed that Denke had sold human meat at the market, while others whispered that he had supplied local restaurants. The police, wary of fueling panic, refused to comment on these theories, focusing instead on the facts. The investigation also revealed the limitations of early 20th century policing. Without modern forensic techniques or centralized databases, the authorities were forced to rely on painstaking detective work and the cooperation of the public. The process was slow, and many questions remained unanswered. How had Denke managed to operate for so long without arousing suspicion? Why had no one connected the disappearances to his home? And what had driven him to commit such crimes? As the days turned into weeks, the scale of Denke's activities became clear. He had preyed on the most vulnerable members of society, choosing his victims with care and disposing of their bodies with chilling efficiency. The police, for all their efforts, could only piece together fragments of the truth. The full story of Karl Denke would never be known. In the next part, we will explore the theories that emerged about what Denke did with the remains of his victims, including the persistent suspicions that he sold meat to neighbors or local markets. The investigation into Denke's crimes would raise questions that lingered long after his death, casting a shadow over Münsterberg and the wider region. Stay with us as we continue to unravel the legacy of the Butcher of Ziebice, a man whose crimes challenged the very foundations of trust and community. As the investigation into Karl Denke's crimes deepened, the question that haunted both police and townspeople was not only how he had managed to kill so many, but what he had done with the remains. The jars and barrels found in his cellar told a story of methodical preservation, but they also raised disturbing possibilities that would ripple through Münsterberg and beyond. The most persistent and chilling theory was that Denke had sold human flesh as meat. This suspicion was not born of wild rumor alone, but from the practical realities of the time and the evidence found in his home. In the years following World War I, food shortages were common, and many people supplemented their diets with whatever they could find. Denke, known for his homemade sausages and smoked meats, was a regular vendor at the local market. He sold pork, bacon, and lard, often at prices lower than his competitors. His products were popular, and many townspeople had purchased food from him over the years. When police cataloged the contents of Denke's cellar, they found not only preserved human remains but also a variety of sausages, smoked meats, and jars of fat. Some containers were labeled with names or dates, while others bore only cryptic marks. The forensic science of the 1920s was not advanced enough to conclusively determine the origin of the meat, but the sheer volume of preserved flesh, combined with Denke's market activities, fueled speculation that he had mixed human meat with pork and sold it to unsuspecting customers. The authorities, aware of the potential for panic, were cautious in their public statements. They neither confirmed nor denied the rumors, focusing instead on the ongoing investigation. Privately, however, many officers believed that Denke had indeed disposed of some remains by selling them as food. The alternative, that he had simply stored the flesh for years without purpose, seemed equally implausible. The impact of these suspicions on the community was immediate and profound. People who had once trusted Denke now questioned every meal they had purchased from him. Families who had bought his sausages or lard wondered if they had unwittingly consumed the remains of his victims. The local market, once a place of bustling commerce, became a scene of whispered conversations and fearful glances. Some vendors saw their sales plummet as customers grew wary of buying meat from anyone they did not know personally. The press, sensing the public's anxiety, reported on the theories with a mix of caution and sensationalism. Headlines speculated about cannibalism in Münsterberg and the butcher who fed the town. National newspapers picked up the story, and soon the name Karl Denke was known across Germany and beyond. The case became a symbol of hidden evil, a reminder that even the most ordinary places could harbor unimaginable horrors. For the police, the question of what Denke had done with the remains was more than a matter of public curiosity. It was central to understanding his motives and methods. Investigators interviewed market vendors, customers, and anyone who had purchased food from Denke. They examined his financial records, looking for evidence of unusual transactions or large purchases of pork. They also consulted butchers and food experts, seeking to determine whether it was possible to disguise human meat as pork or beef. The answers were inconclusive. Some experts believed that with the right spices and preparation, it would be possible to mask the taste and texture of human flesh. Others argued that the differences would be obvious to anyone familiar with meat. The lack of definitive forensic evidence left the question unresolved, but the suspicion lingered. Theories about Denke's motives also proliferated. Some believed that he was driven by financial need, using the sale of meat to supplement his modest income. Others saw his actions as the result of a profound psychological disturbance, a compulsion to kill and dismember, with the disposal of remains as a secondary concern. A few speculated that Denke's crimes were ritualistic, pointing to the careful labeling and preservation of body parts as evidence of a deeper obsession. Psychologists and criminologists who later studied the case noted Denke's ability to compartmentalize his life. He maintained a public persona of kindness and charity, while privately engaging in acts of extreme violence and deception. His meticulous record-keeping and methodical approach suggested a mind that valued order and control, even in the midst of chaos. The community, meanwhile, struggled to come to terms with the implications of the case. The idea that a trusted neighbor could commit such acts, and that others might have unknowingly participated by purchasing his products, shook the foundations of trust in Münsterberg. Some residents withdrew from public life, avoiding the market and shunning social gatherings. Others became suspicious of anyone who seemed different or reclusive, fearing that another Denke might be hiding in their midst. The authorities, recognizing the need to restore public confidence, increased their oversight of local food vendors and butchers. New regulations were introduced, requiring more rigorous inspections and record-keeping. The market, once a symbol of community and abundance, became a place of scrutiny and suspicion. Despite the efforts of police and officials, many questions remained unanswered. The true number of Denke's victims was never established, and the fate of much of the preserved flesh found in his home could not be determined. Theories about the sale of human meat persisted for years, becoming part of the folklore of Ziebice and the surrounding region. In the next part, we will turn to the final days of Karl Denke's life, his time in custody, his suicide, and the immediate aftermath of his death. The story of the butcher of Ziebice was far from over, and its impact would be felt long after the man himself was gone. Stay with us as we continue to explore the legacy of a case that blurred the line between fact and nightmare, and forced a community to confront the darkest possibilities of human nature. As the investigation into Karl Denke's crimes reached its fever pitch, the man at the center of the storm sat quietly in his cell at the Münsterberg jail. The world outside was in turmoil. Police officers cataloged evidence, Journalists crowded the streets, and townspeople whispered in fear and disbelief. Yet Denke himself remained a figure of calm, almost eerie composure, as if the events unfolding around him were happening to someone else. From the moment of his arrest, Denke had been cooperative but reserved. He answered questions politely, never raising his voice or showing anger. When confronted with the evidence found in his home, the jars, the barrels, the ledger, he offered little explanation. He neither confessed nor denied, instead responding with vague statements or silence. To the officers who guarded him, Denke seemed detached, as if he had already retreated into a world of his own making. The authorities, desperate for answers, brought in doctors to assess Denke's mental state. The field of forensic psychology was still in its infancy, but the experts who examined him noted his lack of emotional response and his apparent inability to grasp the gravity of his situation. Some speculated that Denke was suffering from a severe personality disorder, while others believed he was simply resigned to his fate. Whatever the cause, it was clear that Denke was not going to provide the closure that investigators and families so desperately sought. As the days passed, the pressure on the police mounted. The public demanded answers, and the press published daily updates on the case. Rumors swirled. Some claimed that Denke was part of a larger criminal network, while others insisted that he had acted alone. The authorities, for their part, focused on building a case that could withstand scrutiny. They prepared to charge Denke with multiple counts of murder, relying on the physical evidence and the testimony of Vincent Olivier, the man who had escaped Denke's attack. But before the case could go to trial, Denke took matters into his own hands. On the night of December 22, 1924, just 2 days after his arrest, Karl Denke was found dead in his cell. He had fashioned a noose from a handkerchief and a strip of his own bedding, and hanged himself from the bars of his cell window. The discovery was made during a routine check by the jailer, who immediately raised the alarm. Despite efforts to revive him, Denke was pronounced dead at the scene. The news of Denke's suicide sent shockwaves through Münsterberg and beyond. For many, it was a bitter end to a case that had already defied comprehension. The man who might have explained the horrors found in his home was gone, taking his secrets with him. The families of the missing were left with unanswered questions, and the police were forced to close the case without a trial or confession. In the days that followed, the town was gripped by a mixture of relief and frustration. Some residents felt that justice had been served, that Denke's death was a fitting end for a man who had caused so much suffering. Others were angry that he had escaped accountability, denying his victims and their families the chance to see him answer for his crimes in court. The press, which had followed the case with relentless intensity, now turned its attention to Denke's final act. Newspapers across Germany and Europe published lurid headlines. The butcher of Münsterberg cheats the hangman. Denke's death ends a reign of terror. Secrets die with the killer. Editorials debated the meaning of Denke's suicide. Was it an admission of guilt, an act of cowardice, or simply the final expression of a deeply disturbed mind? In the absence of a trial, speculation flourished. Some journalists suggested that Denke had been driven to suicide by the weight of his crimes, unable to face the consequences of his actions. Others argued that he had planned his death from the moment of his arrest, determined to maintain control over his fate to the very end. A few even hinted at conspiracy, suggesting that Denke had been silenced to protect others involved in his crimes. The police, for their part, dismissed these theories, insisting that Denke had acted alone and that his suicide was the act of a desperate man. The impact of Denke's death was felt far beyond Münsterberg. In Berlin, Vienna, and Prague, newspapers ran stories about the case, often embellishing the facts with rumors and speculation. The image of the quiet organist who had lived a double life became a symbol of hidden evil, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life. The case was discussed in universities, police academies, and even in the German parliament, where lawmakers debated the need for better oversight of transient populations and stricter regulations for food vendors. For the people of Münsterberg, the aftermath of Denke's suicide was a time of reckoning. The town, once known for its peaceful streets and close-knit community, was now infamous as the home of the Butcher of Ziebice. Residents struggled to come to terms with the fact that a man they had trusted and respected had committed such unimaginable acts. Some withdrew from public life, while others became more vigilant, suspicious of anyone who seemed different or reclusive. The authorities, eager to restore order and confidence, implemented new measures to prevent similar crimes. Food vendors and butchers were subject to stricter inspections, and the police increased their surveillance of transient populations. The market, once a symbol of community and abundance, became a place of scrutiny and suspicion. Yet for all these efforts, the legacy of Karl Denke could not be erased. His crimes had exposed the vulnerabilities of a society that prided itself on trust and neighborliness. The case became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of evil, the limits of community, and the dangers of complacency. In the final part of our story, we will explore the long-term impact of Denke's crimes on Ziebice and beyond, the fear, folklore, and cultural legacy that continue to shape the way we think about hidden killers. We will also consider how modern criminology views the case and what it tells us about the darkness that can exist behind even the most ordinary of facades. Stay with us as we conclude the story of Karl Denke, a man whose life and crimes blurred the line between reality and nightmare, and whose legacy endures to this day. In the weeks and months after Karl Denke's suicide, the town of Münsterberg, now Ziebice, struggled to return to normal. But the shadow of Denke's crimes lingered, casting a pall over the community that would last for generations. The house at 10 Stawowa Street, once a symbol of quiet respectability, became a place of whispered stories and fearful glances. For many, it was impossible to walk past without recalling the horrors that had been uncovered within its walls. The immediate aftermath was marked by fear and suspicion. Families who had once trusted their neighbors now looked at each other with uncertainty. The market, once the heart of the town, was quieter than ever. Vendors who had known Denke for years found themselves shunned, their goods left unsold. Some residents moved away, unable to bear the weight of the town's new reputation. Others stayed, determined to reclaim their sense of community, but the old sense of safety was gone. The story of Denke quickly became the stuff of local folklore. Children dared each other to approach the abandoned house, and parents warned them to stay away. Stories grew in the telling. Some claimed to have seen Denke's ghost wandering the streets at night, while others insisted that the house was cursed. The truth, already stranger than fiction, became entwined with legend. The press coverage, both in Germany and across Europe, ensured that Denke's name would not be forgotten. Newspapers published lurid accounts of the case, often blurring the line between fact and rumor. Theories about cannibalism, secret societies, and hidden accomplices flourished. For years, Denke's crimes were cited as a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil could hide behind the most ordinary of faces. But beyond the fear and fascination, the case had deeper cultural and psychological implications. Denke's ability to live undetected for decades, his careful cultivation of a respectable persona, and his choice of victims, those on the margins of society, forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. How could a community so proud of its closeness and vigilance have failed to see what was happening in its midst? What does it mean when the very qualities that make a society strong, trust, charity, and neighborliness, are used as tools of deception? These questions resonated far beyond Ziebice. In the years that followed, criminologists and psychologists studied the case, seeking to understand the mind of a man like Denke. He became a textbook example of the hidden killer, someone who could compartmentalize his life so completely that even those closest to him saw only what he wanted them to see. His meticulous record-keeping, his methodical approach to both life and death, and his apparent lack of remorse all pointed to a personality profoundly different from the norm. Modern criminology views Denke as a rare but important case. He is often compared to other infamous figures in criminal history, men like Fritz Harman, Peter Kürten, and in fiction Hannibal Lecter. Like these figures, Denke's crimes challenge our assumptions about what evil looks like. He was not a monster in appearance or manner. He was, by all accounts, a gentle and helpful man. It was this very normalcy that allowed him to operate undetected for so long. The comparison to fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter is not accidental. Both Denke and Lecter are defined by their ability to hide in plain sight, to use their intelligence and charm as weapons. But while Lecter is a creation of the imagination, Denke was all too real. His story serves as a reminder that the line between reality and nightmare is often thinner than we would like to believe. For the people of Ziebice, the legacy of Denke's crimes is complex. In the years after his death, the town slowly rebuilt its sense of community. The house at 10 Stawawa Street was eventually demolished, its foundations erased but not forgotten. Memorials to the victims were erected, and efforts were made to remember those who had been lost, not as nameless victims but as individuals whose lives mattered. The case also led to changes in how missing persons were reported and investigated. Authorities recognized the need for better record-keeping, more thorough investigations, and greater support for those on the margins of society. The lessons learned from Denke's crimes helped shape modern policing in the region, making it harder for such horrors to go unnoticed. Yet for all the changes, the psychological scars remained. Survivors and families of the victims carried the weight of unanswered questions. The community, once so sure of itself, was forced to confront the reality that evil can wear a friendly face. The story of Karl Denke became a warning, a reminder to look beyond appearances, to question what we think we know, and to remember that vigilance is the price of safety. Today, Denke's name is rarely spoken in Ziebice, but his story endures in books, documentaries, and academic studies. He is remembered not only as a killer, but as a symbol of the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. His crimes continue to fascinate and horrify, not because of their brutality, but because of the way they challenge our understanding of human nature. In the end, the legacy of Karl Denke is not just a story of murder and deception. It is a story about the fragility of trust, the importance of community, and the need to remember those who are too often forgotten. It is a reminder that the most ordinary lives can hide the darkest secrets, and that the line between good and evil is never as clear as we would like to believe. Karl Denke lived unnoticed for decades, a quiet man with a secret life, until one night revealed what even the darkest minds could hardly imagine. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most chilling true crime cases. If you found this story thought-provoking, let us know where you're listening from, and share your thoughts on how communities can protect themselves from hidden dangers. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.